Good afternoon and welcome back to our discussion on the poetry of Kamala Das. Now, yesterday we talked about Das's life. We talked about the various dimensions of her work. We talked about her being adept simultaneously in two languages. And we also talked about the predominant themes of the critique of patriarchy, the expression of her subjectivity as a woman poet, and her comment on her art and the way she uses language as major themes in Kamala Das's poetry. This was what we had discussed, and we had also started off by discussing one of the most important poems by Kamala Das, titled Autobiography. In today's discussion, what I will like to take forward is this sense of identity, sense of belonging, and also and the definitions of a subjectivity. And also, I would like to take a look at the poems that talk about her sexuality and critique the institution of patriarchy, especially in the Indian context. So that is my agenda, as it were, for today. And let me share my screen so that I am able to show you the text, as it were. Right. Okay. So this was where we had stopped. This is the poem titled An Introduction. And it talks about how she is in this state of liminality, as it were, and she speaks as the voice of almost all Indian women. Anywhere and everywhere, I see the one who calls himself I in this world is tightly packed like the sword in its sheath. Now, there have been, of course, critical commentaries on the way in which Kamala Das is approximating the voice of the Indian woman, as it were, and casting herself in a position to talk about the female voice. Now, you'll have to understand, of course, that Kamala Das, at this point of time, is in a certain privileged position. That is to say, she has had exposure in the English language. She belongs to a middle class family. So you will have to be alert to the fact in your, especially the GEC for students who study women's empowerment, is that it is not necessary that one single woman can talk about all women as such. The Dalit woman, for example, would be doubly marginalized than her, upper class English speaking counterpart. So, the subaltern woman would be probably speaking in a different voice than Kamala Das's. So you'll have to be aware of the inflections and the nuances of every sense of class, caste, etc., when you deal with the texts in your syllabus, as to what is the disempowerment or what is the degree of disempowerment, and how is the poet or the writer seeking empowerment in this context, right? So even though Kamala Das is, as it were, claiming an universal voice for the woman poet figure, for the narrative woman figure, the AMY that she calls here, we will need to take this with a degree of qualification. But then she talks about the woman's multiple dimensions. The woman a sinner, a saint, beloved, betrayed. I have no joys that are not yours. That's an interesting comment to make, that the usurpation of the joys, no aches which are not yours, I too call myself I. So this dialectic between the you and the I, the patriarchal figure and the critique of patriarchy, it's as it were, in the sense that Kamala Das is suggesting that even though she's trying to sort of establish her subjectivity through her voice, the the definition of that subjectivity is always restricted or brought into sharper focus by you, the patriarchal voice, as it were, right? Therefore, it's as it were, the you and the I are hyphenated almost, and the you is always dominating this uh, this I. So, in that sense, writing becomes that moment of liberation, from where the I to call myself I becomes a moment when the poet, as it were, unshackles herself and asserts her own identity, right, from the you. So it's in this sense that writing becomes an act of political liberation, as it were, right? So this is a very important poem in that sense that Kamala Das has sort of written in the sense that it introduces us to the multifarious concerns within her poetry. Now, since I've spent some time over this poem, let me now move on to this poem titled "A Hot Noon in Malabar." And this is Kamala Das's persistent, at this point of time, she was in Bombay, she was yearning for her hometown, Malabar. And this again links us to this question of belonging of the poet. Let me read through this, and then we'll come back to these questions of belonging, of language, of identity once again. This is a hot noon for beggars with whining voices, a noon for men who come from the hills with parrots in a cage and fortune cards, all stained with time, right? So, in that sense, he's talking about Malabar, the coastal towns and villages, and the age old same kind of people who inhabit this land. A counterpart for this would be probably Malgudi by R.K. Narayan, where you have these age old rituals being repeated, as contrasted with the dynamism and the originality of the city, as it were. For brown Kurava girls with old eyes who read palm in light sing-song voices. For bangle sellers who spread on the cool black floor those red and green and blue bangles, all covered with the dust of roads, miles, grow cracks on the hills so that when they clambered up our porch, the noise was grating. Once again, notice something. You see, this is something which you need to also figure out, especially my honors students here, is, this generation of poets, including Ezekiel, Ramanujan, Kamala Das, and the others, were all sort of trying to bring in the inflection of the Indian reality within the English poetry. Not only that, they're also trying to create a language that is intimate, that is marked by a simplicity. In fact, you will find that Kamala Das's poetry, if you read through them, her vocabulary was not very large in that sense. His vocabulary was extremely limited. But in the way in which Das actually applies this vocabulary, in the way in which these very minute details, and we were talking about feminine écriture in the earlier class, in the way in which women write themselves. You see the small, significant details that would have been available to the woman's gaze, as it were. The bangle sellers who spread on the cool black floor those red and green and blue bangles, grow cracks on heels, so that when they clambered up our porch, the noise was grating. So the sound, the texture of the skin, the parched nature of the skin, the sounds made, the scent of the hills. The poem becomes, as it were, a miniature of the coastal town and village. Strange, this is a noon for strangers who part the window drapes and peer in, their hot eyes brimming with the sun, not seeing a thing in shadowy rooms, and turn away and look so yearningly at the brick-ledged well. This is a noon for strangers with mistrust in their eyes, dark, silent ones who rarely speak at all, so that when they speak, their voices run wild like jungle voices. Yet this is a room, yes, this is a noon for wild men, wild thoughts, wild love. And then she returns back to her present, which is enclosed, which is so different from what the erstwhile reality was. From the ground, you have, a journey towards the city, as it were, with strangers with mistrust in their eyes, dark, silent ones. And the city is, as it were, seen as a site of desire and lust and, and a sense of wildness. To be hot, to be here far away is torture. Wild feet stirring up the dust. This hot noon at my home in Malabar, and I so far away. Right. So, this once again, this wildness, this trampling, traveling feet versus the enclosed space of the city and the silence. Now, this contrast, as it were, this situatedness of the poet in the present, in an urban setup like Bombay, and at the same time rooted in her memories of Malabar. Now, that is the question that now brings me to this question about Kamala Das's poetry and prose. And you see, we've talked about how Das's childhood memories were all located traveling from Calcutta to Malabar, and the way in which the Malayalam language and the English language sort of dominated her consciousness in that sense of the term. Now, therefore, Das's personality is, as it were, split down the middle. Part of it, is conditioned by the English language, its realities, the colonial life of the city. And part of it is rooted in the wildness, in the scattered villages, in the Malabar coastline, its sounds, senses. And you can see very interestingly that when Das is talking about the city, these senses disappear. But the senses of sound, touch, etc., come back once she's talking about her childhood memories, which are very powerful and intimate. Now, this is leading me then onto this question as to where does the Indian English poet reside, and what is the rationale for the choice of the language. Now, we can always say that somebody is free to express himself or herself in any language that she wishes. We see, in what language does a poet think? In what language does a poet dream? Right. So Kamala Das seems to have this very interesting dichotomy. If I look at the date of her texts, I see that the first book of poetry that Kamala Das is publishing is called The Sirens. It's tentatively 1964. The first book of short stories, Pakshiyude Manam, is also published, interestingly, in the same time, same date, 1964. So here is a poet who is composing different genres in different languages, but approximately around the same time. So we have poetry collections in 1964, The Sirens; 1965, Summer in Calcutta; 1967, The Descendants; 1973, The Old Playhouse and Other Poems. And we have comparable texts leading to 1973, Ente Katha. Right. So in the poetic idiom, Das is using the English language. And in the prose, she's using Malayalam, which should probably have been reversed because poetry, after all, is more intimate. After all, poetry is the language of emotions, very often feelings, whilst prose is a slightly more distanced. Now, what Das is probably doing here is thinking about her readership. Was the Malayalam readership so very mature enough to sort of respond to her very confessional poetry? Or did she think that her English audience, attuned as it were to the more confessional poems during this period by Sylvia Plath, etc., would be more receptive to similar poems from an Indian writer? Now, of course, 1973, it all changes, but in her short stories, she creates certain, barriers so that the protagonists, they talk of the same kind of female subjugation and protest against patriarchy, but through a distance. It is the I, it is as if that the I does not come directly to the foreground, it remains slightly in the background. It is mediated through by another personality of the character, right? And then 1973, she launches into an autobiography, which is very intimate. So by this time, she's established herself and she recognizes literary notoriety, fame, whatsoever. And she's then emboldened to talk about herself in her own language, in prose. Till then, the confessional poetry comes through in the English language. So this identity, speaking three voices, writing in two, and dreaming in one, the rootedness in one place, and the rootedness in memory in her childhood, the Malayali and the English writer, as it were, sort of merge into one, and Kamala Das is sifting forever in the search for her identity in these two poems. Let me bring you to another autobiographical poem here, My Grandmother's House. There is a house now far away where once I received love. And once again, she's situating this in Malabar. That woman died, the house withdrew into silence. Snakes moved among books. I was then too young to read, and my blood turned cold like the moon. How often I think of going there. Now, again, you see, this is once again memory and the constitution of space through memory. Now, if you think about space, and many of you are students of other literatures, also history, science, whatever, whenever you think about space, please also remember that while space is geographical, when you read space, it is constructed. It is imaginatively constructed, laden with values. Now, very often these past spaces become haunted with suggestiveness, association, memories. Say, for example, if you loved somebody, say 20 years ago in a particular place, that space becomes laden with so many memories. You attach some space with time and love, and then somebody betrays you, then that space becomes laden, the space and time becomes laden with so many memories. Right? So what Kamala Das is suggesting here is how, memory constructs spaces. And my blood turned cold like the moon. How often I think of going there to peer through blind eyes of windows or just listen to the frozen air. It is as it were, air is frozen, that space is frozen in memory. Right? And you can immediately relate to how certain memories are imprinted on your consciousnesses and how that space is eternalized. If you remember Keats, you'll remember Keats's Ode to the Grecian Urn, and how Keats suggests that this, kind of a pageant of the bold lover who's about to kiss his beloved being frozen in time. So it's like a memory frozen in time, a space to which she wants to go back to, just to listen to the frozen air, or in wild despair, pick an armful of darkness to bring it here, to lie behind my bedroom door like a brooding dog. You cannot believe, darling, can you, that I lived in such a house and was proud and loved. So, interestingly, this is the state of the woman as a child, where she's free, where she's cared for, where she's sheltered, protected, and where, it's in her memory, this space where she has her own identity, as it were. Now, interestingly, if you're interested more in this topic, you can read a poem by Philip Larkin. This is available in the Palgrave's Golden Treasury. You can search it on the internet if you want. It's called Maiden Name. And it talks about a female voice which talks about, two states, one prior to marriage and one after marriage. And which one talks about the memories, the photographs, the laughter before marriage. And the other talks about the weight, the responsibilities, the betrayals after marriage, right? So we are talking about two kinds of states. And for Kamala Das, this entire memory of Malabar, the entire memory of the grandmother's house, then becomes a part of that childish, girlish past, where she is carefree, she's loved for, where she is so intimately related with her space. And now this contrasts with her space. I who have lost my way. So I lived in a house and was proud and loved. So that's the past. That is time which has gone. And I who have lost my way and beg now at strangers' doors to receive love, at least in small change. In the sense that her betrayal that her abuse in marriage, that her betrayal in love, her self-confessed affairs with men. So the search for love and the failure to attain that love in either sexuality or fulfillment, versus the unconditioned, unrequested love of childhood. So these two states are, as it were, these two geographies are, as it were, contrasted. One of the past, accessible through the memory, frozen, as it were, even the air being frozen at that point of time, versus the geography of the present, where the woman's subjectivity is, as it were, completely shattered, and she remains a beggar looking for small love, lust, and therefore, perpetually in a kind of a search. So the two poems that we've read today are marked by an overwhelming presence of nostalgia, overwhelming, desire to return to that childhood status where her subjectivity is free and is not broken, as it were. Now comes, let me take you through a few poems which articulate Kamala Das's critique of patriarchy and the way in which the subjectivity of the woman is progressively dismantled and shattered, taken away, right? And please remember, every time that Kamala Das is writing about this state of disempowerment, every time that Kamala Das is contrasting these states of empowerment, freedom, innocence versus experience, disempowerment, every act of writing is political in the sense that it is a voice of protest. It is a voice which articulates the woman's need to be free. So language becomes a tool, the poetic medium of The confessional lyric becomes a tool. The intimate I encroaches upon our space to take us, to force us to confront the ways in which society behaves. So the freaks, and he talks about the man. He talks, turning a sun-stained cheek to me, his mouth a dark cavern, once again, a dark cavern of lust, as it were, where stalactites of uneven teeth gleam, his right hand on my knee. So the man's need, sexual need of the woman, and the failure of love, while our minds are willed to race towards love. So even if there is this discourse about love, the protestations about love, what overshadows the man is his demand for lust. But they only wander, tripping idly over puddles of desire. So, the spaces on the body which they haunt and which create ripples of desire, as it were. And you notice how Kamala Das is, suddenly turning this poem, or providing a kind of a leap into sexuality, a frankness and the candor that he talks about the spaces of the woman's body, which are specifically zones of pleasure, as it were. Can this man with nimble fingertips unleash nothing more alive than the skin's lazy hungers? So, when we talked about Ente Katha, if you remember, we talked about Kamala Das talking about the reason for her writing an autobiography. And I'll recollect those lines once again. It says, some people told me that writing an autobiography like this with absolute honesty is like doing a striptease. So she's bearing herself in that sense. True, maybe I'll first strip myself of the clothes and ornaments. So she's putting her nakedness, the body before us. Then I intend to peel off this light-browed skin and shatter my bones. But then she goes beyond the body, as it were. At last, I hope you'll be able to see my homeless, orphan, intensely beautiful soul, the soul which is seeking love beyond desire, right? But homeless, orphan, intensely beautiful soul, deep within the bone, deep down under, beneath even the marrow, in a fourth dimension. It is this fourth dimension that this particular poem is wondering about, whether the nimble fingertips unleash nothing more alive than the skin's lazy hungers. Who can help us who have lived so long and have failed in love? The heart an empty cistern. So once again, this is where, you see, the metaphors become very interesting. It's talking about the cistern in the courtyard, as it were, which is empty, which seeks fulfillment, and the woman's demand for love. The heart an empty cistern, waiting through long hours, fills itself with coiling snakes of silence. So the failure of love, the failure of companionship in marriage and without marriage, beyond marriage, even in other relationships, and this gulf between the man who is inflamed with desire versus the woman who is obsessed with love, and the consequent failure to bridge this is what Kamala Das is forever writing about. A poetry is about this failure, this failure of the deeper need of the woman. Please remember that while you are reading Kamala Das's poetry, and no doubt, there is a lot of sensationalism, there's a lot of body parts, there's a lot of eroticism in the poetry, a lot of candor. Yet these poems are haunted in many ways by the failure of love between men and women, and the coiling snakes of silence, as it were, that creep into the relationship. through long hours fills itself with coiling snakes of silence. I am a freak. Who is a freak? Why does she call herself a freak? A freak is somebody who is, as it were, you know, somebody who is not normal, who's beyond the normal pale. But is she a freak? It's only to save my face I flaunt at times grand flamboyant lust. So, in that sense, Kamala Das is holding us and warning us that this poet persona that she presents, of this poet who is sensational. Yesterday we had a question as to why is Kamala Das famous? Is it because of her, unconventional poetry, or is it because of her sensational poetry? We will. She's trying to, as it were, address this issue. She's trying to suggest that, while her poetry might talk about the lust, the desires, the inflamed passions, deeper down, that lust really conceals, and this is true in almost of all her poems, a failure of the male perspective to understand the woman and her need for love. Now that is where, therefore, she becomes a freak who displays her passion, but who in reality is marked by and haunted by a loneliness and a failure of love. So it is in this sense that you see that this yearning gulf between what she wants and what she projects, what she feels and what she projects, is Das's way of answering this debate as to why her poetry is sensational. It is not sensational because she wants to be deliberately erotic. Her erotic poems do talk about the need of the woman, but beyond that need, beyond the physicality of the poems, lies an acknowledgement of the failure of the male to understand the perspective of the woman. Right. Then, therefore, in that sense, you see, Kamala Das is talking about these poems become, not only her poems, her stories, as it were, but they also, in a certain sense, talk about the lack of understanding between the man and the woman, especially in the Indian context, right, where the man only looks to the woman as idealized or as a symbol of eroticism, but never really as an equal. Right. Now, let me take you through another poem, The Looking Glass. Getting a man to love you is easy. Only be honest about your wants as a woman. Stand nude before the glass with him. And this is one of the examples of the ways in which Das writes with extraordinary candor and often borders on the sensational, so that he sees himself the stronger one and believes it so. And you're so much more softer, younger, lovelier. Right? So the beauty of the woman, way more good looking in that sense, beyond the man's presence, but the man then feels himself as young, as stronger, and therefore that relationship becomes the relationship of power, as it were. Admit your admiration. Notice the perfection of his limbs, his eyes reddening under the shower, the shy walk across the bathroom floor, dropping towels, and the jerky way he urinates. Now, that is once again extraordinarily candid, as it were. And once again, the kind of gaze of the woman who notes every tiny little detail, and the male body. So here is a reverse gaze, as it were, moving on from the woman to the man and the male body, as it were. right? And acknowledging the desire of the woman, all the fond details that make him male and your only man. Gift him all, gift him what makes you woman, the scent of long hair, the musk of sweat between the breasts, the warm shock of menstrual blood, and all your endless female hungers. And then once again, you see, the poem begins with desire and the aspects of desire, in the sense that, it's talking about the physical body, the copulation, the nude, the act of love making. But then this poem then moves on to the question of loving and being loved. Oh, yes, getting a man to love is easy, but living without him afterwards may have to be faced. A living without life when you move around meeting strangers with your eyes that give up their search, with ears that hear only his last voice, calling out your name, and your body, which once under his touch had gleamed like burnished brass, now drab and destitute. So, thus is here talking about, once again, a woman who is left alone, lonely, who's yearning for the touch of the male. Is this poem a kind of an acknowledgement of the fact that her husband had largely left her alone and pandered to his own homosexual needs? Is this poem, therefore, the poem of many Indian women left alone and who yearn for the touch of their partners? So, in that sense, you see, what is constructed here repeatedly is the woman as existing in a state of solitude, in a yearning of love, where she's never fulfilled, in the sense that her own subjectivity and identity is never really catered to. Instead, she has to submit and surrender to the larger identity of the patriarchal male and bear it alone. And it is this angst, this pain, that Kamala Das is talking about. Now, let me take us through the last poem that we'll discuss today, The Old Playhouse. Das writes, you plan to tame a swallow, to hold her in the long summer of your love. So swallow, the bird, which is a symbol of freedom, a symbol also of tenderness, right? To hold her in the long summer of your love, so that she would forget not the raw seasons alone and the homes left behind. So the swallow here obviously is the woman who's sort of taken away from her nest, taken away from her home in the long summer of your love, but also her nature, her urge to fly, and the endless pathways of her sky. So that independent subjectivity of the woman is, as it were, curtailed by the span of your hand, which creates a kind of a bind for this entire subjectivity. You think about Ramayana and the way in which, there's this Lakshman Rekha, which patriarchy sort of creates around the woman, which she can never transgress, because if she transgresses, there's the fear of a Ravana waiting for her. So in that sense, it's like the hand becomes the Lakshman Rekha, the kind of boundary beyond which the woman's identity can never then be expressed. It was not to gather knowledge of yet another man that I came to you. So she's talking about a state beyond marriage, as it were, that I came to you, but to learn what I was, and by learning to learn to grow. But every lesson that you gave was about yourself. So once again, you see, for Das, the perspective of the man is always about himself, the central figure of the patriarchy, and that all consciousness, as it were, flows from the man, right? Therefore, what I was, and by learning to grow, but every lesson you gave was about yourself, right? So the lesson of patriarchy, that, the entire household and its entire welfare depends upon the perspective of the man. You are pleased with my body's response. And once again, thus talking about the body of the woman as a site where this exploitation takes place, a site where love and love making become a kind of a pleasure for the man only. You dibbled spittle into my mouth. You poured yourself into every nook and cranny. You embalmed my poor lust with your bittersweet juices. Now, notice once again the candor, the extraordinary force with which Das is talking about the body fluids, talking about the body cavities, and the ways and oblique references to the acts of love making, and which is always marked by a sense of bitter sweetness. Sweetness in the sense of fulfillment, bitterness in the sense that, beyond love, there's always the image of power. You called me wife. I was taught to break saccharine into your tea and to offer at right moment the vitamins. Cowering under your monstrous ego, I ate the magic loaf and became a dwarf. Right? In a sense, you see, once again, this institution of patriarchy which towers over the woman and subjugates her personality continuously. It is as it were the man is telling her, I am the general and you are the soldier, and you'll have to fulfill every command that I make. Right? Therefore, cowering beneath your monstrous ego, I ate the magic loaf and became a dwarf. So, it's as it were, the marriage which is seen as the fairy tale, right, of things going fine ever after, becomes a kind of a magical dystopia in the sense that the woman becomes a dwarf. I lost my will and reason. To all your questions, I mumbled incoherent replies. So, lost my will and reason. This loss of subjectivity of the woman is what Das is talking about as the institution of patriarchy bringing in. The summer begins to pall. I remember the rudder breezes of the fall and the smoke from the burning leaves. Your room is always lit by artificial lights. Your room windows always shut. Even the air conditioner helps so little. All pervasive is the male scent of your breath. So once again, you see, the sense of enclosure is being trapped within a kind of a prison walls, within a Lakshman Rekha, as it were, within a boundary which is dominated by, once again, the male scent. You see, you'll have to look at these particular lines through which the woman's way of writing, the intimacy sort of comes through her perception, her intimate perception, and the overpowering scent of the man. There is no more sing. The cut flowers in the vases have begun to smell of human sweat. There's no more singing. So instead of the swallow, which had the license to fly, now she's trapped within the four walls. There is no more singing, no more dance. And it's autumn now, the summer has faded, and the woman and the man has lost interest in the desires of the woman. Therefore, no more singing, no more dances. My mind is an old playhouse with all its lights put out. Now that's the dominant metaphor. The woman's body as a site where, which is the source of pleasure and playing, right? Playing with the body. But play does not involve engagement on a more serious term. So instead of serious relationships, there's always the sense of, a kind of a superficial play. The strong man's technique is always the same. He serves his love in lethal doses. For love is Narcissus at the water's edge, haunted by its own lonely face. So once again, you see, this relationship is seen in patriarchal sort of prism of Narcissus. The man, Narcissus, was this beautiful youth who was always fell in love with himself and stared at his image in the water, so much so that after his death he was turned into a flower. So Narcissus is self-absorption, and patriarchy is marked by this self-absorption, this turning of the gaze towards itself forever, for which the woman is only an outsider and marginalized. So for love is Narcissus at the water's edge, haunted by its own lonely face, and yet it must seek at last an end, a pure, total freedom. So now she's talking about love, that love which seeks, like Narcissus, a kind of a self fulfillment, a total freedom. It must will the mirrors to shatter and the kind night to erase the water. So, you know, what happens at the end of the poem is this shattering recognition that, the image that is created by the old playhouse and by this, image of love and joy and the domestic household in the Indian family is in reality a prison for the woman and a self-absorption for the male, and that this illusion of love and support is then broken by these lines of poetry. So in that sense, in this particular poem, the words seem to be like weapons, seem to be sharp blades which are thrust to tear apart the facades of domesticity that are built around the Indian condition. Thus sees Indian marriages essentially as patriarchal prisons, where the woman's subjectivity is decimated and where gradually the swallow of the woman is rendered into an old, decaying playhouse where the will is sapped and the agency and the power of the woman, the subjectivity of the woman, is gradually stripped away. Right. And once again, let me take you to that those very first lines of the Ente Katha, where she talks about bearing her bones, taking you underneath the skin and into her soul, which is one deep well, WELL, well of loneliness and lovelessness. So, what is Das's major contribution is not really to talk about the way in which she's talking about the female body, although that is important to her. But what is important is the state of lovelessness and the state of isolation and loneliness, and to tear apart the facade of the family that is sort of so very romantically crafted through the image of the through literatures, as it were. So it is in this deconstruction of the Indian family, and it is in the deconstruction of the process through which the woman's subjectivity is progressively taken away, a ruthless critique of marriage and relationships as powers, as unidimensional sites of male power, and the difference between love, lust that Kamala Das seeks to portray, a world where women, despite their pleasures, are actually locked into caves of isolation, as it were. So the last poem really that I would like to talk about in this particular class, I'm sorry, this is one more poem that I should have talked. The same thing. Fond husband, ancient settler in the mind, old fat spider, weaving webs of bewilderment, be kind. You turn me into a bird of stone, so from the swallow, the living swallow, you are, turning me into a granite dove, somebody who has no life. So like the old spider who's drawn the kind of prey into the web of patriarchy. So in this case, you see, patriarchy is considered as this grand web which traps the woman and sucks the life out of her. You build round me a shabby room and stroke my pitted face absent-mindedly while you read. With loud talk, you bruise my pre-morning sleep. You stick a finger into my dreaming eye. So the woman is, as it were, pulverized. All her pleasures, all her personal time taken away. And yet on daydreams, strong men cast their shadows. They sink like white suns in the swell of my Dravidian blood, secretly flow the drains beneath sacred cities. But it is at this point that Kamala Das will then confess the urges of the woman. Therefore, when you leave, I drive my blue battered car along the bluer sea, along the coastline. I run up the 40 noisy steps to knock at another's door. So she's talking about transgressing beyond marriage. Through peepholes, the neighbors watch. They watch me come and go like rain. Ask me, everybody, ask me what he sees in me. Ask me while he's called a lion, a libertine. Ask me while his hand sways like a hooded snake before it clasps my pubis. Once again, notice the extraordinary candor. Notice the extraordinary, as it were, recognition of the sexual moment, of the power of the male hand. Ask me why, like a great tree felled, he slumps against my breasts and sleeps. Ask me why life is short and love is shorter still. So it's once again, you see, the point is that there is the search for love, but all that can be achieved, according to Kamala Das's, poems, is an act of lust, as it were. This poem, this act of of lust by the woman, this act is a kind of a rebellion. It's a kind of movement against the male world and an assertion of her own, as it were, presence, her own selfhood. Ask me what is bliss and what its price. And once again, the ways in which such deviation from the norm of marriage brings, what the consequences will be. So the woman is, as it were, deprived in marriage, and even if she transgresses outside it, she is branded, as in the scarlet letter, as a slut and a prostitute. Therefore, in any relationship that she goes in, the shadow of patriarchy looms large on her, sucking her personality out and rendering her from a living, flying swallow into a granite bird. Therefore, poem after poem, and I've just taken a few, suggests how patriarchy as an institution completely subjugates the presence of the woman, and her attempts of asserting her own personality are progressively stripped. Now, the one place where Kamala Das can express this angst, the one place where she can articulate, is through language and through the act of writing. And therefore, these poems become acts of protest. These poems become moments through which the voice of the woman, which is otherwise unheard, can be brought into the horizon, as it were. Now, I think I will stop here for the time being, and we have two more poems to go, in the sense that in our next discussion we will pick up on the threads of what we have to discuss about Das's poetic technique and the concept of the feminine écriture, in the way she uses the form of the lyric, the speaking, subjective voice of the I. Now, I see that there are a few questions, but we'll take that later on, maybe tomorrow. Shomira and I will try and answer your question tomorrow, since I have another class to go to. So let me stop here for the time being, and we'll come back tomorrow to discuss the technique within Kamala Das's poetry, and we'll talk about the use of language and form. Thank you very much for having attended the discussion, and look forward to having you tomorrow again, same time.